Hello and welcome to the very first episode of English Mastery, a podcast dedicated to helping you reach that Cambridge C1 level in English. I'm Clara.
And I'm Leo. I'm so excited to be starting this journey with all of you wonderful listeners out there. This podcast is going to be absolutely transformative for your English skill. I just know it.
Someone had their morning coffee.
2 cups, actually. But hey, enthusiasm is contagious, right? And I genuinely believe that with the right approach, mastering advanced English listening skills can be both challenging and fun.
That's true. Over the next 6 episodes, we'll be covering different aspects of listening comprehension that will help prepare you for the Cambridge C1 exam. From news broadcasts to academic lectures, informal conversations, storytelling, professional contexts, and specific exam strategies.
And today we're kicking things off with navigating news and current affairs, one of my favorite topics because staying informed is so empowering.
Before we dive in, let me ask you, Leo, do you remember when you first started listening to news broadcasts in English? Was it challenging?
Oh, definitely. I remember trying to follow BBC World Service when I was still learning English, and it felt like they were speaking at supersonic speed. But that struggle made crossing that threshold so rewarding. What about you?
I actually avoided news in English for years because I found the vocabulary so specific and the delivery so rapid. I would miss key points and feel frustrated. That's exactly why we're addressing news comprehension first. It's often a significant hurdle for language learners.
But once you clear that hurdle, a whole world opens up. Shall we get started with our first segment on decoding news headlines?
Let's do it. So headlines, they're designed to be attention-grabbing but concise, which creates unique linguistic challenges.
Absolutely. Headlines are like little puzzles, and solving them is actually really fun once you get the hang of it. They often drop articles, auxiliary verbs, and use the present simple for past events to create that sense of immediacy.
Good point. Take this example, PM faces backlash over new policy. There's no the before PM, no is before facing, and we don't know which policy or even which country's prime minister without context.
That's such a perfect example. And headlines love abbreviations too. Next PM, UN, WHO, COP26. These can be particularly challenging if you're not familiar with the institutions or events being referenced.
Let's not forget ambiguous headlines. My personal favorite was "Red tape holds up new bridge." Is the bridge being delayed by bureaucracy, or is red tape physically supporting the structure?
Haha, that's brilliant. I love those double meaning headlines. I collected some in my teaching days. Here's another. Kids make nutritious snacks. Are the kids making the snacks, or are they the snacks? The joys of English syntax.
Exactly. When preparing for the C1 exam, it's important to practice reading headlines and predicting the content of the article. This develops your ability to understand implied context.
And don't get discouraged if you don't understand every headline right away. I still sometimes get confused by headlines in the financial section, but it gets easier with practice. Every headline you decode is a small victory.
Moving on to our second segment, political discourse and diplomatic language. This is where things get particularly nuanced.
Oh, I find this fascinating. Political speech is an art form, sometimes frustrating but always interesting. Politicians rarely say directly that something is bad. Instead, they might call it challenging or requiring further consideration.
Yes, euphemisms are everywhere in political reporting. Economical with the truth instead of lying, revenue enhancement instead of tax increase, or downsizing instead of firing people.
I remember watching a press conference after a clearly failed international summit where the spokesperson kept saying the talks were frank and productive discussions, diplomatic code for they argued the whole time and accomplished nothing. But isn't it amazing how language can be so creatively deployed?
You would find the positive spin in diplomatic failures, wouldn't you? But yes, it's important for C1 candidates to recognize this hedging language. Phrases like, "It appears that sources suggest," or "it could be argued that," all indicate varying levels of certainty or commitment to the statement.
Another thing I recommend listeners pay attention to is modality. Those modal verbs like might, could, should, and how they're used to express possibility, obligation, or speculation. They're subtle but so important in political discourse.
And don't forget about passive voice, which is often used to avoid assigning direct responsibility. Mistakes were made rather than the government made mistakes.
Great point. I've found that practice really helps with this. Try listening to political interviews with the specific goal of identifying when direct questions are being evaded. It becomes a bit of a game, and suddenly you're developing critical listening skills while having fun.
Our third segment focuses on economic terminology and context, which can be particularly challenging even for advanced learners.
But also incredibly useful. Understanding economic news gives you insights into so many aspects of daily life, from housing markets to job opportunities. I actually started listening to financial podcasts as a language learning technique, and it improved my professional vocabulary tremendously.
I wish I had your enthusiasm when I first encountered terms like fiscal policy, quantitative easing, or stagflation. I remember hearing bearish market and wondering what bears had to do with stocks.
Well, once you learn that bearish means prices are expected to fall and bullish means they're expected to rise, it all starts to make sense. And these animal metaphors actually make economic concepts more memorable.
True. For our listeners preparing for C1, it's worth familiarizing yourself with how numbers and statistics are presented in news reports. You'll often hear phrases like rose by 2 percentage points versus rose by 2%, which mean different things.
Absolutely. And news reports love comparative language when discussing economic trends. Outperformed expectations, fell short of projections, exceeded last quarter's growth. These comparisons are key to understanding the significance of the numbers being reported.
Financial news also has its own forecasting language. You'll hear analysts saying things like, the outlook remains uncertain, or markets are expected to rebound. Understanding these predictions is important for the exam.
I find it helpful to visualize the graphs they're describing. If they talk about sharp decline, I imagine a steep downward line or a gentle curve for gradual improvement. Connecting the language to mental images makes these abstract concepts so much clearer.
Let's talk about international news accents. This is something many C1 candidates find particularly challenging, understanding English spoken with different accents from around the world.
What an opportunity, though. Each accent is like a new flavor of English. They all have their own unique characteristics that make the language richer and more diverse. I personally love Australian English with its distinctive vowels and colorful expressions.
You would find joy in the challenge of deciphering arvo for afternoon or servo for service station, but you make a good point. Minus the C1 exam might include different varieties of English, so it's important to expose yourself to speakers from the UK, US, Australia, Canada, and other English-speaking countries.
Absolutely. And don't forget that within each country there are regional accents too. I remember when I first heard a strong Scottish accent in a BBC interview, it took real concentration to follow, but now I find it much easier because I've trained my ear.
Speaking of training your ear, one effective practice technique is to listen to international news channels like CNN, Al Jazeera English, or ABC Australia, and compare how they cover the same story.
That's brilliant advice. You not only practice with different accents, but also get multiple perspectives on world events. It's win-win. I started doing that during the pandemic and found it so engaging that I've continued the habit.
Regional terminology is another aspect to be aware of. American English might use gas prices, while British English refers to petrol costs. These variations can appear in news reports.
And embracing these differences makes listening so much more interesting. I've started keeping a little notebook of different terms I hear across English varieties. It's become a fascinating linguistic collection. The diversity of English is truly something to celebrate.
Our final segment today is on critical listening practice, which is essential not just for the exam, but for being an informed consumer of news.
This is so important. In today's information-rich world, being able to distinguish between facts, opinions, and biased reporting is an incredibly valuable skill. And the good news is that developing this skill in your second language actually enhances your critical thinking overall.
Listen for language that signals opinion rather than fact. I believe, in my view, it seems that, versus factual reporting, which tends to be more direct and typically cites sources or specific data.
And pay attention to emotive language too. If a news report describes something as disastrous rather than simply negative, or breakthrough rather than development, that could indicate a particular stance or bias.
For the C1 exam, note-taking is a crucial skill. I recommend the Cornell method, where you divide your page into sections for notes, key questions, and summary.
I love the Cornell method. I actually used it all through university and still use it in meetings. Another tip is to develop your own shorthand. Use symbols like arrows for increase/decrease or abbreviations that make sense to you. It's like creating your own secret code, and it makes note-taking much more efficient.
Remember that in the exam, you'll need to identify key information from complex news stories. Practice summarizing news reports in a few sentences, focusing on the main points rather than details.
Yes, and make it a habit to ask yourself questions after listening to news. What are the key facts? What might have been omitted? Is there another perspective? This active engagement makes listening a dynamic process rather than passive consumption, and it's actually quite empowering.
Well, that brings us to the end of our first episode of English Mastery. We've covered a lot of ground today, from decoding headlines to understanding political euphemisms, economic terminology, international accents, and critical listening skills.
What an amazing start to our series. I really hope our listeners are feeling more confident about tackling news and current affairs in English. Remember, every news broadcast you listen to is valuable practice. Even if you don't understand everything, you're training your ear and building your vocabulary.
Exactly. And if you implement the strategies we've discussed today, you'll start to notice improvement in your comprehension of news broadcasts, which will directly benefit your performance in the C1 exam.
Absolutely. And don't forget, learning is a journey, not a destination. Every day brings new opportunities to improve, and that's something to be excited about. I still remember the first time I understood a complete news broadcast without subtitles. It felt like such an achievement.
In our next episode, we'll be exploring academic lectures and professional presentations, where we'll focus on note-taking strategies, understanding specialized vocabulary, and following complex argumentation patterns.
I can't wait for that one. Academic lectures might sound intimidating, but they follow patterns that, once recognized, make comprehension so much easier. We'll help listeners navigate academic discourse with confidence and even enjoyment.
Thank you all for listening to this first episode of English Mastery. We hope you found it useful in your C1 preparation journey.
We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with fellow English learners who might benefit. Until next time, keep listening, stay curious, and remember, every step forward is progress worth celebrating.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of English Insights, the Art of Academic and Professional Communication. I'm Clara, and I am absolutely thrilled to be launching this series with all of you today.
And I'm Leo. Clara and I will be your guides through the nuanced world of academic and professional communication in English. I've got to say, I'm really excited about this project, though probably not quite as excited as Clara is.
Oh, come on, Leo. This is going to be amazing. Just think about all the fascinating topics we're going to explore, all the helpful strategies we'll be sharing, and all the wonderful listeners we'll be connecting with. How could you not be over the moon about this?
I'm excited, just measured excitement, something you clearly don't understand.
Life's too short for measured excitement. But okay, let me tell our listeners what they can expect from this series. We'll be examining effective communication strategies from renowned experts across linguistics, pedagogy, and public speaking, all focused on helping you communicate complex ideas to diverse audiences.
Right. And today's episode is Foundations of Effective Academic Communication. We'll explore core principles of successful academic presentations and lectures in English, from linguistic clarity to audience engagement techniques.
I actually used to be terrified of public speaking in college, can you believe that? But once I learned some of these foundational techniques we're discussing today, everything changed. Now I can't wait to share what I've learned.
Let's dive into our first segment, the architecture of academic discourse. This is really about the structural elements that make for effective lectures and presentations.
Structure is everything. I remember attending this conference last year where the speaker had brilliant ideas but presented them in such a jumbled way. Even I, eternal optimist that I am, struggled to find the silver lining in that presentation.
That's exactly the problem. When it comes to academic discourse, organizing complex information logically is crucial. Without a clear structure, even the most groundbreaking content can fall flat.
Absolutely. And the good news is that creating a strong structure isn't that difficult. The most effective presenters typically start with a clear roadmap, telling the audience exactly what they'll cover and in what order.
True. And there's research backing this up. Studies in cognitive processing show that audiences retain information better when it's presented with explicit organizational cues. It reduces the cognitive load and allows listeners to focus on content rather than trying to figure out where things are going.
I love how you always have the research handy, Leo, and transitions between concepts are just as important as the structure itself. Those verbal bridges help audiences follow along as you move from one point to another.
Right. Those transitions can be simple phrases like moving on to our next point, or more sophisticated connections that show relationships between ideas. The key is being intentional about them.
And finding that perfect balance between depth and breadth. You want to go deep enough to be meaningful, but broad enough to be comprehensive. It's like when I'm gardening, I need to plant each seed at just the right depth for it to flourish.
Let's move on to linguistic clarity in academic settings. This can be particularly challenging because academic language often deals with complex, abstract concepts.
But that's what makes it so exciting. Finding ways to make those complex ideas accessible to everyone. I think selecting appropriate terminology for your specific audience is step one.
Definitely. There's a real skill to gauging your audience's familiarity with specialized terminology. I once attended a lecture where the speaker assumed everyone knew statistical terms like heteroscedasticity without explanation.
Oh no. But what a wonderful opportunity that could have been to introduce new terminology clearly. When I teach advanced concepts to my students, I always make sure to define complex terms. And I found that using everyday examples makes abstract concepts so much more accessible.
I think what you're touching on is the effective use of concrete examples to illustrate abstract ideas. There's cognitive research suggesting that concrete examples create stronger memory traces and aid comprehension.
Exactly. And I always encourage people to use analogies when explaining difficult concepts. They create these wonderful bridges between what someone already understands and what they're trying to learn.
Just be careful with analogies, Claire. They can sometimes break down or create misconceptions if the mapping isn't precise. I've seen that happen in science communication especially.
That's a fair point, but I still think the benefits outweigh the risks. And speaking of risks, let's talk about common linguistic pitfalls in academic English. Even small things like overusing passive voice can make presentations harder to follow.
Our next segment focuses on principles of audience engagement. In my experience, this is where many academic speakers struggle the most.
But it's also where the magic happens. When you truly connect with your audience, the whole room just lights up. I absolutely love that feeling.
Not everyone finds it so natural, Clara. For many academics, there's a tension between maintaining scholarly rigor and creating an engaging presentation.
But they're not mutually exclusive. You can definitely have both. It starts with understanding your audience's background and expectations. When I'm preparing a presentation, I always think about who will be there and what they're hoping to learn.
That's a good approach. Research in educational psychology shows that presentations aligned with audience expectations and prior knowledge lead to better learning outcomes. It's about finding that cognitive sweet spot.
And creating intellectual curiosity is such a powerful tool. I love starting presentations with a provocative question or surprising statistic. It immediately gets people interested in what's coming next.
Maintaining that attention throughout is the real challenge, though. The research on attention spans is pretty sobering. Even in academic settings, attention typically begins to wane after about 10 to 15 minutes.
That's where variety comes in. Changing your delivery method every so often, switching between explanations, examples, questions, and visual elements can keep everyone engaged. I used to think my presentations had to be perfect and polished, but I've learned that authentic enthusiasm goes much further than perfection.
There's also the challenge of balancing formality with accessibility. Academic speakers often err on the side of being overly formal, which can create distance between them and the audience.
So true. Some of the best academic talks I've attended have had moments of humor or personal connection. Those human touches don't diminish the scholarly content, they enhance it by keeping the audience connected.
Let's discuss the role of prosody in academic speech, something people often overlook, but is incredibly important.
Oh, I love this topic. The music of language makes such a difference. The way we use pauses, emphasis, speech rate, it all contributes to how well our message lands.
The strategic use of pauses is particularly powerful. Research shows that brief pauses before key points increase retention of those points, but many speakers rush through important information.
I used to do that. I was so nervous that I'd just speed through everything. Now I consciously slow down for important concepts and give people time to process. It's made such a positive difference in how people respond to my talks.
Managing speech rate is critical for comprehension, especially in international contexts or when presenting complex information. Studies suggest that moderate speech rates of about 150 to 160 words per minute are optimal for comprehension.
And intonation patterns can completely change how people understand your message. I find that using rising intonation for questions and falling intonation for definitive statements helps keep everyone on the same page.
Voice modulation for key points is another technique worth mentioning. Subtle changes in volume or pitch can signal importance. It's like highlighting, but with your voice.
Exactly. I call it vocal highlighting when I'm coaching people on presentations. Your voice is such a powerful tool. We should use all its dimensions. I remember this workshop I attended where the facilitator spoke in a completely flat monotone. The content was fantastic, but the delivery made it so hard to stay engaged.
That's a common issue. The good news is that prosodic skills can be developed with practice and awareness. Recording yourself and listening critically can be quite illuminating. Our final segment today covers establishing academic authority, something that's particularly important for early career academics or when speaking outside your primary specialty.
This is such an important topic, and I think it starts with those verbal and nonverbal markers of expertise. Little things like confident posture, deliberate movements, and making eye contact can make such a difference.
True, though there's a careful balance to strike. Research in communication studies indicates that perceived expertise comes from balancing confidence with intellectual humility. Acknowledging limitations or areas of ongoing inquiry actually enhances credibility rather than undermining it.
I couldn't agree more. Being transparent about what we know and don't know builds trust. I always try to model this in my own presentations, showing that it's perfectly fine not to have all the answers.
Speaking of not having all the answers, addressing challenging questions effectively is another key aspect of establishing authority. The worst thing you can do is bluff or become defensive.
Absolutely. Those challenging moments are actually wonderful opportunities to demonstrate your expertise. I've found that acknowledging the validity of tough questions and responding thoughtfully, even if that means saying, "I'll need to look into that further," actually strengthens your credibility.
That's consistent with the research. Studies of perceived expertise show that honesty about knowledge boundaries is more effective than pretending to know everything. The goal is creating a professional but approachable persona.
Yes, I think of it as being both the expert and the guide. You're demonstrating your knowledge while also bringing your audience along with you. That combination of authority and accessibility is so powerful.
It's worth noting that establishing authority looks different across cultural contexts. What signals expertise in one setting might seem arrogant or insufficient in another. Cultural awareness is important here.
That's such a good point, Leo. And actually, that's something we'll be diving into more deeply in episode 4 when we discuss navigating cultural and linguistic diversity. I can't wait for that one. Wow, we've covered so much ground today, from the structure of academic discourse to linguistic clarity, audience engagement, prosody, and establishing authority. I'm feeling so energized by all these ideas.
It's definitely a lot to take in. If I could summarize our key takeaways, effective academic communication requires intentional structure, clear language with well-defined terminology, audience awareness, strategic use of voice, and a balanced approach to establishing expertise.
And the wonderful thing is that all of these skills can be developed with practice and awareness. Even the most technical or complex material can be presented in ways that engage and enlighten audiences when we apply these principles.
In our next episode, we'll build on these foundations to explore crafting compelling arguments and explanations. We'll dive into rhetorical techniques, evidence presentation, and logical structures that make complex ideas both accessible and convincing.
I'm already looking forward to it. We'll talk about the anatomy of academic arguments, evidence presentation strategies, and the art of academic explanation. It's going to be fantastic.
We'll also cover narrative techniques in academic discourse, addressing complexity and nuance, and rhetorical devices for academic impact.
Thank you so much for joining us for this first episode of English Insights, the art of academic and professional communication. If you enjoyed today's discussion, please share it with colleagues or friends who might find it helpful.
And if you have questions or topics you'd like us to address in future episodes, feel free to reach out. Until next time, this is Leo.
And Clara, wishing you clear communication and engaged audiences in all your academic endeavors. See you next time. Hello and welcome to English Mastery. I'm Clara, and I'm so excited to be starting this journey with all of you today.
And I'm Leo. We've been working on this podcast series for months now, and I can't tell you how thrilled I am that it's finally happening.
That's right. English Mastery is all about taking your vocabulary to that next level, specifically focusing on C1 level vocabulary and beyond. Because let's face it, when you're at an intermediate level in English, sometimes it feels like you've hit a plateau, right?
Absolutely. I remember when I was learning Spanish, there was this point where I could communicate just fine, but I couldn't express myself with the precision or sophistication that I wanted. It was so frustrating.
And that's exactly the gap we're addressing in this series. Today's episode is The Foundations of Advanced Vocabulary, where we'll explore what makes vocabulary advanced, how to retain new words effectively, and how to start building your own vocabulary expansion system.
Plus, we'll dive into word families, contextual learning, and setting realistic goals for your vocabulary journey. So much goodness packed into one episode.
Absolutely. And in future episodes, we'll be tackling nuanced vocabulary, academic and professional terminology, figurative language, conversation skills, and building sustainable vocabulary systems. But today, we're laying the groundwork for all of that.
I can't wait to dive in. Shall we get started?
Let's do it! So let's start by understanding what actually defines C1 level vocabulary. For those unfamiliar with the CEFR framework, that's the common European framework of reference for languages, minus C1, is considered advanced proficiency.
Right. And vocabulary at this level is characterized by greater precision, nuance, and appropriateness to specific contexts. We're talking about moving beyond basic synonyms to words with specific connotations and usage patterns.
Exactly. I found this perfect quote from 5-Minute English that really sums it up. Building a strong vocabulary is essential for effective communication, both in spoken and written English. But what's interesting is the gap between B2 and C1 vocabulary usage.
Oh, that gap is huge. At B2, you're functional. You can express yourself on most topics, but often in a somewhat general way. But at C1, suddenly you can discuss nuances, subtle differences, and complex ideas with much more precision.
Definitely, and according to Magoosh, an expanded vocabulary creates opportunities to communicate in ways that can benefit your academic pursuits, career goals, and your daily experiences. I found that to be so true. When I expanded my vocabulary in French, whole new worlds opened up.
I had the same experience. Suddenly I could read newspapers without a dictionary, understand jokes, and actually express complex thoughts rather than just simplified versions of what I wanted to say.
And that's what we want for our listeners. The ability to express themselves with more sophistication and precision. It's not about using big words to sound smart. It's about having the right word at the right time.
Absolutely. One thing I always tell my friends who are learning English is that advanced vocabulary gives you a kind of linguistic freedom. You're no longer constrained by a limited set of words trying to express complex ideas.
That's such a great way of putting it, Leo. It's like having a bigger toolbox. You can choose exactly the right tool for the job, rather than making do with the few basic tools you have.
Now that we understand why C1 vocabulary matters, let's talk about the psychology of vocabulary retention. Because learning new words is one thing, but actually remembering them, especially when you need them in conversation, that's something else entirely.
Oh, this is such an important topic. Our brains are fascinating when it comes to learning vocabulary. Did you know that we typically need to encounter a word multiple times in different contexts before it really sticks?
I didn't know the exact science behind it, but that definitely matches my experience. There's this phenomenon called the forgetting curve that actually shows how quickly we forget new information without reinforcement.
Exactly. The forgetting curve was identified by Hermann Ebbinghaus. And it shows that without reinforcement, we forget about 70% of what we learn within 24 hours. Pretty shocking, right?
That explains so much about my college experience. But the good news is that with spaced repetition, reviewing words at increasing intervals, we can dramatically improve retention.
Absolutely. And another critical factor is creating meaningful connections to new vocabulary. Our brain remembers things better when they're connected to emotions, stories, or personal experiences.
I find that so true. Like last year when I learned the word serendipity, I was having coffee with a friend I hadn't seen in years, who I ran into by complete chance, and she used that word to describe our meeting. I've never forgotten it since.
That's the perfect example. The emotional engagement made that word stick. Magoosh mentions this idea too, saying, understanding how a word is used in context is one of the best ways to not only remember the word's meaning, but to understand how English sentences are constructed.
Context is crucial, and it actually leads perfectly into our next segment about word families and morphology.
Let's dive into word families and morphology, which is basically how words are formed. Understanding this can exponentially increase your vocabulary with much less effort.
Exactly. Rather than learning individual words in isolation, you can learn entire word families. Take the root word construct, for example. From that we get construction, constructive, reconstruct, deconstruct.
Constructively, reconstruction, constructionist. See how many words come from just one root? And if you understand how prefixes and suffixes work, you can often guess the meaning of words you've never seen before.
Absolutely. Prefixes like where meaning again, un meaning not, or pre meaning before, these small additions completely change the meaning of the base word. 5-Minute English actually has a whole lesson on prefixes using pre, re, and sub.
I love learning that way. And suffixes are just as important, like able meaning capable of being, meant to form nouns, or ify to turn something into a verb.
The beauty of this approach is that instead of memorizing 10 separate words, you're understanding a pattern that applies to hundreds of words. It's so much more efficient.
Definitely. Let's try a quick exercise. Take the word appear. What word family members can we identify?
Great example. We have appearance, disappear, disappearance, reappear. And from Magoosh's advanced vocabulary list, they mention apparent, which means obvious or visible, coming from the same root.
Perfect. They give the example, it was apparent to me that he was a trained dancer, but the others had no idea. And we could also add, apparently, transparency, apparition.
This is such a powerful approach. Recognizing these patterns not only helps with understanding new words, but also with spelling and pronunciation.
Absolutely. I'd encourage our listeners to try deconstructing complex words they encounter. Identify the root, prefix, and suffix. It's like being a word detective.
Now let's talk about context and collocation, which is essentially how words naturally pair together in English.
This is so important. Words almost never exist in isolation. They have relationships with other words that can completely change their meaning or appropriateness.
Exactly. Take the word heavy. We might say heavy rain, heavy traffic, or heavy responsibility, but we wouldn't say heavy price. That would be high price.
Great example. These partnerships between words, collocations, often don't follow logical rules. They're just the way native speakers conventionally use the language.
And mastering these collocations is one of the key differences between intermediate and advanced speakers. 5-Minute English highlights this, saying they focus on providing context and practical usage examples, helping you understand not just the meaning of words, but also how to use them correctly in sentences.
That reminds me of when my Swedish friend kept saying she was taking a coffee instead of having a coffee. The meaning was clear, but it immediately identified her as non-native.
I've been there. When I was learning Portuguese, I once told someone I was making a decision instead of taking a decision. They understood me, but they also corrected me immediately.
It's those little things that make such a difference. Magoosh points this out too. Understanding how a word is used in context is one of the best ways to not only remember the word's meaning, but to understand how English sentences are constructed.
So what are some good tools for identifying common collocations?
Great question. Collocation dictionaries are fantastic, both online and physical versions. Also, corpus tools like the British National Corpus or the Corpus of Contemporary American English let you see how words are used in millions of real examples.
And don't forget good old reading. Paying attention to word partnerships in authentic texts is probably the most natural way to absorb collocations.
Now let's talk about setting your vocabulary expansion goals. It's so important to be intentional about this process.
Absolutely. I think many learners make the mistake of being too ambitious, like trying to learn 50 new words a day. That's just not sustainable.
Exactly. Quality always beats quantity when it comes to vocabulary acquisition. Magoosh has a great tip about this. Pick 1 or 2 words from this vocabulary list to learn every day, and you will be well on your way to having a more diverse vocabulary.
I love that. Just 1 or 2 words a day adds up to hundreds of new words in a year, and you'll actually remember them, which is the whole point.
Yes, and it's important to choose vocabulary domains that are relevant to your specific needs. If you're studying medicine, focus on medical terminology. If you're in business, prioritize business vocabulary.
That's such an important point. I remember when I was living in Madrid, I specifically focused on vocabulary related to real estate because I was apartment hunting. It was immediately useful.
That's the perfect approach. Another important aspect is tracking your progress. Whether it's a vocabulary journal, a digital app, or flashcards, having a system to review words you've learned is crucial.
Definitely. I use a digital flashcard system with spaced repetition. It automatically shows me words I'm about to forget, which is so efficient.
That sounds great. I'm a bit more old school. I have a vocabulary notebook divided by themes, but whatever system works for you is the right one.
And remember, as Magoosh wisely notes, studying vocabulary can be hard and slow work. Don't give up or get frustrated if you don't see results right away. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Such an important reminder. Consistent, regular effort over time is what leads to real progress. And celebrating small victories along the way keeps you motivated.
We've covered so much ground today. We explored what makes vocabulary advanced, discussed the psychology of vocabulary retention, examined word families and morphology, highlighted the importance of context and collocation, and talked about setting realistic vocabulary goals.
It's been a fantastic start to our series. I hope our listeners are feeling inspired to approach vocabulary building in a more strategic, sustainable way.
Absolutely. And remember that everyone's vocabulary journey is different. The key is consistency and finding methods that work for you personally.
That's right. As 5-Minute English says, we believe that vocabulary learning should be an enjoyable and ongoing process. It shouldn't feel like a chore. It should be exciting to discover new words that help you express yourself more precisely.
I couldn't agree more. And speaking of precise expression, that's exactly what we'll be focusing on in our next episode. Precision in expression, nuanced vocabulary.
Yes, we'll be exploring the subtle differences between similar words, examining connotations versus denotations, and looking at how to select the perfect word for any context.
I'm already looking forward to it. We'll also discuss gradable and non-gradable adjectives, register and formality, and vocabulary for expressing nuanced opinions.
It's going to be another vocabulary-packed episode. Until then, I encourage everyone to start implementing some of the strategies we discussed today. Maybe choose 1 or 2 new words to learn, or try deconstructing some complex words you encounter into their roots and affixes.
Great suggestions. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with friends who might benefit from boosting their advanced vocabulary. We'd be so grateful.
Absolutely. Thank you all for joining us for this first episode of English Mastery. We'll be back soon with more vocabulary insights and strategies. Until next time.
See you then.
Hello and welcome to Linguistic Nuances, Decoding the Subtleties of English. I'm Clara, and with me is my wonderful co-host, Leo. We're absolutely thrilled to kick off this new podcast series with you today.
That's right, Clara. I'm Leo, and I couldn't be more excited about launching this series. Today is April 28th, 2025, and we're embarking on a fascinating journey through the rich landscape of the English language.
Our goal with this podcast is to explore those subtle yet powerful aspects of English that can dramatically change the way we communicate. We'll be diving into everything from word choices to sound-alikes that trip up even the most advanced speakers.
Absolutely. And I think our listeners are going to love how practical this information is. Whether you're a native speaker looking to refine your communication or an advanced English learner aiming for that extra level of precision, these episodes will give you those aha moments that make language learning so rewarding.
So true. And today we're starting with a topic I absolutely love: connotation versus denotation, the emotional palette of words. We're going to explore how words carry both literal meanings and emotional associations that can dramatically alter communication.
I can't wait to get started. I've actually been collecting some great examples all week for this episode. My wife kept asking why I was making notes every time someone said something interesting on TV.
Let's begin by defining these 2 key terms. The denotation of a word is its literal dictionary meaning, the basic, explicit definition you'd find if you looked it up.
Right. And connotation refers to the emotional implications and associations that a word carries beyond that literal meaning. It's like each word comes with its own emotional baggage.
That's exactly it, Leo. And what's fascinating is that while denotation tends to remain stable, connotations can vary widely based on cultural contexts, personal experiences, and even change over time.
You know, I was thinking about this the other day when my daughter came home from school and said something was sick. I was momentarily concerned until I remembered that for her generation, sick has a positive connotation. It means excellent or amazing.
That's a perfect example. The denotation of sick refers to illness or poor health, but for younger generations, the connotation has completely flipped to something positive. And this gap between denotation and connotation is where so much linguistic richness lives.
Absolutely. According to Alan Partington, connotation is actually a problem area for language learners because it's so crucial for expressing attitude. Without understanding connotations, it's nearly impossible to grasp the true intent of messages.
That's so true. I remember when I was teaching English abroad, one of my students confidently told a classmate they looked cheap when they meant to say they looked economical or thrifty. Same denotation of not expensive, but wildly different connotation.
Oh no, I hope you were able to clear that up before any feelings were hurt.
So let's talk about some connotation pairs that come up frequently in professional settings. One classic example is cheap versus economical.
Great example. Both words denote something that doesn't cost much money, but cheap often carries a negative connotation of poor quality or even tactness, while economical has a positive connotation of being smart with resources.
Exactly. This distinction becomes so important in workplace communication. Imagine telling a client you found a cheap solution to their problem versus an economical solution.
I actually made that exact mistake in my first job out of college. I proudly told my boss I found a cheap vendor for our conference materials, and she very gently suggested I describe them as cost-effective when presenting to the executive team.
That was good advice. Another pair that comes up all the time is stubborn versus determined. Both describe someone who won't easily change their position or give up, but with very different emotional undertones.
Absolutely. Stubborn suggests an unreasonable refusal to change, while determined affirms that same quality as admirable persistence. I'm sure we all know people we might describe as determined to their face, but stubborn behind their backs.
Leo, too real, but also very true. And these word choices can significantly impact workplace dynamics and how people are perceived. Another pair I love is curious versus nosy.
Oh, that's a great one. Both refer to someone who asks questions and seeks information, but curious has a positive connotation of intellectual engagement, while nosy suggests inappropriate prying into matters that don't concern you.
Exactly. And I've noticed that gender often plays a role in which term gets applied. Women asking questions in the workplace might be labeled nosy, while men doing the same thing might be described as curious or thorough.
That's an excellent point about how connotations can reinforce biases. It's something we should all be mindful of in our language choices.
What's fascinating about connotations is how they can shift over time and across different cultures. Words don't stay static in their emotional associations.
Absolutely. One of my favorite examples is the word literally, which traditionally denoted something that actually happened. But now it's often used as an intensifier with a connotation completely opposite to its denotation.
Yes, when someone says, "I literally died laughing," they obviously didn't actually expire. The connotation has evolved to mean figuratively but emphatically. It drives language purists crazy, but it's a perfect example of how connotations change.
And awesome is another great example. It used to denote something that inspires genuine awe or fear, like the awesome power of a hurricane. Now it's just, well, awesome, like a good sandwich or a fun movie.
Exactly. The connotation has shifted from something truly monumental to just something generally positive. I find the regional variations fascinating too. Even within English-speaking countries, the same word can carry different connotations.
Like how biscuit means something completely different in the UK versus the US, or how thongs refers to footwear in Australia but something quite different in America.
Yes. And technology has had such an impact on connotations too. Think about words like tweet or viral. Their primary connotations have completely transformed in the digital age.
That's so true. Viral used to have exclusively negative connotations related to disease, but now it can be something content creators actively strive for. And social media has definitely accelerated these connotation changes, hasn't it?
Absolutely. What might have taken decades in the past can now happen in months or even weeks. As terms spread across platforms, remember when Karen was just a name without particular connotations?
Oh wow, yes. And now it carries very specific connotations about entitled behavior. That happened so quickly.
Let's talk about connotations in academic writing and presentations, which is a context where being precise about these emotional shadings becomes particularly important.
Definitely. In academic contexts, there's often this illusion of complete objectivity, but word choices still carry connotations that can subtly influence how research is perceived.
Exactly. Take terms like claims versus argues versus demonstrates when referencing another scholar's work. All denote a similar action of presenting an idea, but the connotations range from skepticism to endorsement.
That's such a good point. If I write, Smith claims that climate change is accelerating, it sounds like I might not agree, but if I write Smith demonstrates that climate change is accelerating, I'm implicitly endorsing their findings.
Precisely. These subtle distinctions matter enormously in academic discourse, and sometimes seemingly neutral academic language can hide biases through connotation.
I noticed this in my graduate studies. Research on certain populations would use clinically neutral terms that actually carried negative connotations, like describing non-Western cultural practices as primitive or undeveloped, rather than traditional or indigenous.
Yes, and navigating discipline-specific connotations can be challenging too. The same term might carry very different connotations in psychology versus sociology or economics versus political science.
That's true. I remember attending an interdisciplinary conference where the term rational actor kept causing confusion. Economists were using it with positive connotations about efficiency, while sociologists were skeptical of the term's implications.
And for students or researchers just entering a field, these discipline-specific connotations aren't always obvious. Are there tools you recommend for analyzing connotation in your own writing?
Great question. One practice I've found helpful is having readers from different backgrounds review my work. Sometimes we're blind to connotations that are obvious to others. There are also digital tools that can highlight potentially loaded terms, though they're not perfect.
That's excellent advice. I also think studying published works in your field with a specific focus on connotation can help. Pay attention to which terms seem neutral versus contested, and how different scholars might use the same terms with different connotative shades.
So we talked about recognizing connotations, but let's discuss how we can use connotation deliberately in persuasive communication.
This is where it gets really interesting. Understanding connotations allows you to choose words that not only convey information, but also the precise emotional tone you want. It's like having a more sophisticated palate as a communicator.
Exactly. Politicians are masters at this. Think about how different it sounds to talk about tax relief versus tax cuts. The first connotes that taxes are a burden we need relief from, while the latter is more neutral.
Or inheritance taxes versus death tax, same denotation, completely different emotional framing. But this deliberate use of connotation does raise ethical considerations, doesn't it?
Absolutely. There's a fine line between effective communication and manipulation. When we select words specifically for their connotations, we need to consider whether we're clarifying or misleading.
I think that's especially true in marketing and advertising. Is it ethical to call something all natural, knowing it carries positive connotations of health and environmental friendliness, even if the product doesn't actually deliver those benefits?
Great example. And this applies to how we communicate with different audiences too. We might need to adopt our connotative language based on who we're speaking to.
Definitely. A term that has positive connotations in one community might have negative ones in another. Being aware of these differences is crucial for effective cross-cultural or cross-generational communication.
I learned this the hard way when I used the term wicked in a presentation to a conservative client, thinking it would sound current and positive like my teenage niece uses it, but they interpreted it with its traditional negative connotation.
Oh no, that's a perfect example of connotations varying across different groups. Let's try a quick practice exercise. Imagine you're writing an email about a project that's behind schedule. What words might have inappropriate connotations that you'd want to avoid?
Great exercise. I'd avoid saying the project is failing or problematic. Both have strong negative connotations. Instead, I might say it's facing challenges or requiring adjustment, still honest about the situation, but with connotations that suggest solvability rather than disaster.
Excellent. And instead of saying someone missed deadlines, which connotes personal failure, you might say they're refining their timeline or adjusting deliverables. Still accurate, but less blame-oriented in its connotations.
As we start wrapping up our discussion, I'm curious, what do you think is the single most important takeaway for our listeners about connotation versus denotation?
That's a great question. For me, it's understanding that nearly every word choice we make carries these emotional shadows. Connotations aren't just special literary devices, but part of everyday communication. Being aware of them gives you more control over how your message is received.
I love that. For me, it's about developing a habit of asking, what else might this word suggest beyond its dictionary definition? Especially in sensitive or important communications, that extra moment of consideration can make all the difference.
That's such great advice. And I think it's worth emphasizing that connotations aren't inherently good or bad. They're tools. The key is using them consciously rather than accidentally.
Exactly. And the more we expand our vocabulary, the more nuanced our connotation choices become. Instead of just good or bad, we can select exemplary, adequate, mediocre, or abysmal, each with their specific connotative shade.
That's why I love the title we chose for this episode, The Emotional Palette of Words. That's really what connotations give us, a richer palette for expressing precisely the meaning we intend, including the emotional undertones.
And in our increasingly text-based communication world, where we don't have tone of voice or facial expressions to help, being precise with our connotations becomes even more important.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've covered so much ground today on connotation versus denotation. Any final thoughts before we preview what's coming next?
Just that I hope our listeners will start noticing connotations more in their daily communications, both what they receive and what they create. It's one of those awareness things where once you start seeing it, you can't unsee it.
That's so true. Well, in our next episode, we'll be exploring another fascinating, realistic phenomenon, homophones, when same sounds create different meanings.
I'm really looking forward to that one. We'll dive into words that sound identical but have completely different meanings and spellings, like there, and how they can create confusion, comedy, and creativity in English.
Exactly. We'll look at why English has so many homophones compared to other languages, how regional accents affect them, and some high-stakes situations where confusing homophones can have serious consequences.
Plus, we'll share some strategies for mastering those creaky homophone pairs that challenge even advanced English speakers. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Absolutely. We hope you'll join us then. And if you enjoyed today's episode on connotation versus denotation, please share it with friends or colleagues who might find it helpful. You can also leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts.
Your feedback helps us create better content for future episodes. For now, this is Leo.
And Clara, thanking you for listening to Linguistic Nuances, Decoding the Subtleties of English. Until next time, choose your words wisely. Hello, and welcome to The Art of Effective Communication. I'm Clara, and I've been so excited about launching this podcast that I've been talking my family's ears off about it for weeks.
And I'm Leo. Clara's enthusiasm has been absolutely infectious. We've been planning this series for months, and it's wonderful to finally share it with all of you listening.
It really is. This podcast is all about helping you become a more effective communicate in both your professional and personal life. Whether you're writing emails, giving presentations, or just trying to get your point across in a meeting, we've got you covered.
Exactly. And we've structured this series to build your communication skills from the ground up. We'll be exploring everything from clarity and audience awareness to persuasion techniques and storytelling. We're starting with the fundamentals today, and we'll get more advanced as we go along.
And today's episode is all about clarity, the foundation of all good communication. I don't know about you, Leo, but I've sat through way too many meetings where I left thinking, what was that person even trying to say?
Oh, I've definitely been there. Just last week at my daughter's school fundraising committee, someone spoke for 15 minutes and I still have no idea what they wanted us to do, but I smiled and nodded anyway.
That's exactly why clarity matters. So let's dive in and help our listeners avoid being that person everyone is nodding at while completely confused.
Let's kick things off by talking about the value of clarity. In our fast-paced world, clear communication is more important than ever.
Absolutely. And one thing I always tell people is that clarity isn't just nice to have, it has real-world consequences. When communication is unclear, it costs businesses time, money, and opportunities.
That's so true. I read a study by Siemens that found miscommunication costs companies with 100 employees an average of $420,000 per year. That's not small change.
Wow, that's a staggering figure, Leo. And beyond the financial cost, unclear communication erodes trust and credibility. I've experienced this firsthand in my previous marketing role. When clients couldn't understand our proposals, they'd question our competence.
I've seen the same thing. People equate clarity with competence. If you can explain something clearly, others assume you know what you're talking about. And they're usually right.
Exactly. And the wonderful thing is that clarity builds confidence in both directions. When you communicate clearly, you feel more confident, and your audience feels more confident in you. It's a win-win.
I couldn't agree more. Clear communication creates an environment of trust where people can focus on content rather than struggling to understand what's being said.
Now let's talk about one of the most fundamental aspects of clarity, precision in word choice.
Yes. This is something I'm passionate about. The words we choose make such a difference in how our message is received.
They really do, and one of the simplest rules is to opt for specific terms over general ones. Instead of saying we need to improve our processes, we need to reduce our customer response time from 48 hours to 24 hours.
That's such a good example, Clara. The second version gives people something concrete to work with. I remember when I started coaching my son's soccer team last year, I kept telling the kids to pass better until I realized I needed to be specific about looking up before passing and aiming for their teammates' feet.
That's perfect, Leo. Kids especially need that specificity. Another important aspect is avoiding unnecessary jargon and complex language. I mean, we all know that person who uses big words just to sound smart.
Oh, I've been guilty of that myself. In my first job, I thought using technical terms would make me sound more knowledgeable. It took a mentor pulling me aside to help me realize I was actually making my ideas less accessible.
That's such a valuable lesson, and it leads to another important point. Concrete examples are almost always more powerful than abstract concepts. When you can give a real-world example that people can picture, your message sticks better.
Absolutely. The human brain processes stories and examples much more easily than abstract ideas. That's why I try to include at least one concrete example in every important email I send.
Let's move on to sentence structure and readability. This might sound basic, but it's amazing how much difference sentence construction can make to understanding.
It really is. And sentence length is a big part of this. Research suggests that comprehension starts to drop when sentences exceed about 25 words.
That's fascinating. I try to mix up my sentence lengths when I'm writing important communications. Some short, some medium, but very few long sentences. It creates a better rhythm too.
Rhythm is so important. Speaking of which, the active versus passive voice discussion is relevant here. The team completed the project is clearer than the project was completed by the team.
Yes, active voice is usually more direct and energetic, though I should point out there are times when passive voice is useful, especially when the actor isn't important or when you want to be diplomatic.
Great point. Mistakes were made is a classic example of using passive voice to avoid assigning blame directly.
Exactly. And moving from sentences to paragraphs, logical flow is key. Each paragraph should contain a complete thought, and there should be clear connections between paragraphs.
I find it helpful to read my writing aloud when I'm checking for flow. It's amazing what you catch when you hear it rather than just seeing it on the page.
That's one of my favorite techniques too. It works for presentations as well. My husband always knows when I'm preparing for a big meeting because he can hear me talking to myself in the home office.
Now let's talk about organizing your message. Even with perfect word choice and sentence structure, poor organization can destroy clarity.
Absolutely. A logical structure is so important. I like to think of it as creating a path for your reader or listener to follow. You don't want them getting lost in the woods of your ideas.
That's a great way to think about it. And there are several different organizational patterns we can use depending on our goal. Chronological order is great for processes and stories.
And problem solution works well for persuasive communications. You outline the issue and then present your solution. I use this one all the time in work proposals.
There's also compare contrast, cause effect, and spatial organization. The key is choosing a pattern that serves your purpose and sticking with it consistently.
Exactly. And whatever pattern you choose, signposts and transitions are essential. These are the verbal cues that help your audience follow along. Phrases like first, next, however, and in conclusion.
Those small words do such important work. I still remember my college professor comparing transitions to the mortar between bricks. Without them, even great ideas don't hold together well.
I love that analogy. And good transitions feel natural. They guide the audience smoothly from one idea to the next without calling attention to themselves. Let's talk about something practical, self-editing techniques to ensure clarity. I've found this is where so many people miss opportunities to improve their communication.
Absolutely. We've already mentioned reading your work aloud, which is one of my favorites. It forces you to slow down and actually process what you've written.
Yes. And another powerful technique is the fresh eyes approach. Set your writing aside for a day if possible, then come back and review it. You'll be amazed at what you catch.
That's such good advice. Of course, we don't always have the luxury of time. Another approach is changing the format. If you wrote it on a computer, try printing it out. Or if you normally read on a screen, try reading it on your phone.
That really works. The format change tricks your brain into seeing it newly. I also find it helpful to have a mental checklist of common clarity killers to watch for. Things like undefined acronyms, vague pronouns, and excessive qualifiers.
Oh, qualifiers can really weaken your message. Words like sort of, kind of, possibly, when overused, make you sound uncertain, even when you're not.
Exactly. I had a colleague who would start every opinion with, I just feel like maybe it undermined her excellent ideas before she even expressed them.
That's such a common pattern. Other clarity killers include inconsistent terminology and buried action items. If you want someone to do something, make it explicitly clear what and when.
Yes. I've found that putting action items in bullet points or even highlighting them in some way makes a huge difference in response rates.
Yeah. We've covered a lot of ground today, Clara. Let's recap the key points about clarity and communication.
Great idea. We talked about why clarity matters. It saves time and money, builds credibility, and creates trust. We also discussed the importance of precise word choice, using specific terms over general ones, and avoiding unnecessary jargon.
We explored sentence structure and readability, including optimal sentence length and the benefits of active voice. We also covered the importance of logical organization and using appropriate signposts and transitions.
And finally, we shared self-editing techniques like reading aloud, getting fresh eyes on your work, and watching out for common clarity killers like vague pronouns and excessive qualifiers.
I'm feeling energized about improving my own communication after our conversation today. I hope our listeners are too.
Me too. And this is just the beginning. In our next episode, we'll be building on these clarity fundamentals to discuss knowing your audience.
I'm really looking forward to that one. We'll explore how to analyze different audience types and adapt your communication approach accordingly. It's where clarity meets strategy.
Exactly. Understanding who you're communicating with is just as important as being clear. We'll talk about frameworks for audience analysis, cultural competence in communication, and how to translate technical information for non-technical audiences.
We've got so much more to share in this series. Thanks so much for joining us for this first episode of The Art of Effective Communication. If you found it helpful, please share it with friends or colleagues who might benefit.
And we'd love to hear your thoughts. What clarity challenges do you face in your communication? Let us know on our social media channels. Until next time, communicate with clarity.